Hey everyone, my name is Squirrely and today I want to have a chat about Assassination Rogue and what we can expect going into ToGC. Today's video is going to focus on hard mode, but has great tips for both difficulties on how to maximize DPS for you and your raid for this upcoming raid tier, alongside some small tips to help you get a few steps closer to earning that Tribute to Immortality mount. I hope you enjoy the video, and if you feel like I missed anything, be sure to leave a comment, as I will more than likely make a follow-up video after the next PTR session in 2 weeks.
Let's do it. Seems to be the most. Ice Owl is piss easy. I'm not afraid of wiping on Ice Owl at all.
Starting off with Northrend Beasts, combat starts in the same fashion that Algalon combat starts, and by that I mean, screw this boss, pre-potting is annoying and unpredictable. Combat starts between 13 and 8 seconds before the boss is targetable. Therefore, there is no guarantee on good uptime with your pre-pots. So, you have two options here. Either you can haste pot or flame cap, but given the random combat timer I chose to stick to flame cap as it was the safer guaranteed DPS increase without the loss of the overkill buff. But that isn't to say that you couldn't get lucky and get an 8-second combat timer and get much more use out of your haste pot, which would make it infinitely better than the flame cap. I will say it's way less consistent that way and you might get screwed over, but if you can run it, run it. Now let's talk about cooldowns. The encounter lasts for about 5.5 to 6.5 minutes long, meaning no matter what, we can get 2 rounds of Vanish and Cold Blood so long as we burn them quickly into the fight. A good rule of thumb is to always use these cooldowns in tandem with your trinkets, more specifically, your AP trinkets. Now the question is, where should we burn off the first set of cooldowns? In my opinion, the first Cold Blood should be used as soon as your trinkets proc on Gormok, comboed with a 5 combo point in Venom if possible. Then for overkill, you have 2 options. The first being right as your trinkets come off ICD on Gormok, or during transition between Gormok and their Drumonger bosses. Something important to note about this though, is that if your guild kills this boss very quickly, meaning sub 6 minutes or sub 6:20, you're probably not going to see likely a second Vanish for Ice Howl, and that second Vanish will be very, very good during the increased damage phase. With most of my testing, I found it was better to burn the Vanish right as my trinkets procced rather than hold it, even in the event of the fight being near the 6.5 minute mark, because the damage you gain from having Vanish off cooldown and at the ready for the damage bonus on Ice Howl beat out having a Vanish ready for Acid Maw and Dreadscale. But do research on your raid's kill times and make the best decision for you. Alright, now back to Gormok for just a moment before we move on. A really good way to pump up the raid's DPS here is to make sure you are Trixing an Affliction Warlock every time an ad comes out to make sure they can snapshot the damage bonus onto the snowbolts. I question whether to add this part to the guide because even I felt like this was a little cringe, but I also think if you really wanted to squeeze out any extra DPS that you can, make sure you are Envenom Weaving on the snowbolts in Gormok. Envenom Weaving is when you use Envenom, then quickly swap targets to build your deadly poison on another target. The way I made use of this was by using Envenom on Gormok, swapping to a Snowbolt, casting Envenom on it, then just ping-ponging my uptime between the Snowbolts and the boss. Totally unneeded, but technically, is a DPS increase. I don't have many notes for Acid Maw and Dreadscale for DPS specifically. A lot of guilds will be popping Heroism during this phase, so whatever target your guild decides to focus, pump it as hard as possible. Also, try to get the Warlock you're assigned to stand closer to melee so that they can get their dots snapshotted for both the bosses. What I will say though is, your Cloak of Shadows is really useful during this portion of the boss, so don't be like me and waste it on Acid Maw. The best strategy for Acid Maw and Dreadscale is to save your Cloak of Shadows for Burning Bile while Dreadscale is planted into the ground. Some guilds will require their melee to leave melee range when Burning Bile goes out to ensure they stay alive. You are going to ignore this entirely and just cloak it off. So this...
Got new spray.
Cloak? That's everybody.
You gotta kill before that second spray.
And this doesn't happen, resulting in higher uptime. Outside of that, Ice Howl is very straightforward. There are 2 ways to avoid getting knocked at a melee range. Firstly being hugging the wall, and then secondly, max melee range. This portion of the fight is extremely straightforward, there's not really much going on here. The only other thing to watch out for here is Massive Crash. Make sure you save a movement speed cooldown for that portion of the fight. If your cloak is back up, or you didn't use it on the worms, you can cloak the Arctic Breath, as well as Human Racial it. There is tech to vanish the massive crash stun, but I wouldn't advise that unless you're playing combat, and I leave the combat guides to Kipso. Alright, now let's talk about Lord Jaraxxus. I would say by far this is the easiest fight in the raid alongside faction champions to complete. This boss felt extremely undertuned in PTR, and if they keep him the way he currently is, I think you will likely see this boss just disappear once your raid has some ToGC gear. This fight has a normal combat timer, so you will pre-pot on this boss and likely see heroism go out on the pole. There are two ways to play this fight as an Assassination rogue, single target spec or Blade Flurry Mutt spec. I have a feeling you will see a lot of cheese parses at the start of the phase involving the Blade Flurry build. I tested both specs, and found that more often than not, even with the inconsistencies from Sated not resetting after bosses dying on PTR, almost every log had the cleave spec doing higher DPS than the single target spec. Though I am hesitant to say whether I think the cleave spec will stay relevant, it does seem to perform very well. Here you can see two sample logs I took from Jaraxxus, one being single target with heroism and one being cleave without heroism. There is a potential downside to running the cleave spec though. The ads that you want to cleave off of are called Mistress of Pain, and they like to leap around the arena at random, so you could pop Blade Flurry in all your cooldowns to try and get a ton of extra DPS off on them, just for them to move away from you. So if you do plan on running this spec, just make sure your Death Knights are on top of Death Grips. If you plan on running the single target spec, it's a fairly easy cooldown phase. Pop Cold Blood with the first set of trinkets and vanish when your trinkets come off ICD. Pair that with your haste pots and you're basically set to go. Leave cleave to the classes it suits better and only swap off Jaraxxus for the nether portals and volcanoes. There are only two abilities that you have to worry about using your defensives on during this fight. Incinerate Flesh, which is a target ability that you can just cloak off, and Fell Inferno, which is an AoE the Infernals do. If you don't get targeted with Incinerate Flesh, you can cloak off the Inferno, as well as use Feint on it if it's glyphed. In the last clip I'm showing here, I just want you guys to get an idea of what I'm expecting to happen over the phase. We didn't get a lot of good testing on Jaraxxus as this fight was so easy, we chose to steamroll over it and focus our attention on the fights that mattered more. Nether portals spawn exactly 2 minutes apart, and if your guild is getting 2 nether portals every time you do the boss, I think Blade Flurry is going to be great on the fight, but we did almost no testing with heroism on this boss because it just wasn't important enough to test. I have a feeling this boss against a geared group will die in about 1.5 to the 145 minute range, meaning it is probably better just to be single target, as the Blade Flurry cheese spec gets worse and worse as the fight goes on unless you get a massive DPS boost from the second usage to justify being in the spec in the first place. But these are just my thoughts on the matter. If you choose to use the BF spec and are trying to maximize your DPS, make sure to put your trinkets on ICD about 25 seconds before the pull starts so that they proc while the ads are up. You can also use your haste pot here. In testing, I opted towards using it on the second set of ads. I'm hesitant to say that was a better choice in terms of raw DPS, as the second set of ads usually just jumped away from me. I feel like I was just unlucky in this regard, but who knows. I thought about writing out a whole guide for the faction champions part of this video, and then I thought to myself, this fight's such a joke that it's not really worth it. If you play a rogue, you know how to use Kidney Shot, and you know how to use Cheap Shot, as well as Kick, and hopefully Gouge and Blind. I'm not a big PvP guy, so if you want an extensive guide on how to do this, maybe just go watch some high-rated arenas or something like that, but there just isn't much to say here. There is one strategy that our guild is looking at, which involves just cleaving all of them down, so if you are planning on doing that strategy with your guild, use the Blade Flurry spec and pump. That's really all I have to say. I can almost guarantee that this boss won't be included in the logs. It has too many variables, there's too many ways to do different cheesy things to it. I mean, imagine what a mage's parses will look like on this fight if they're allowed to just living bomb every single target to death.
All right, here we go. Misdirect, 5, 4, 3.
Moving on to
2,
Twin Valkyrs,
1.
there are two different strategies you can use for this boss. One is the door strat and the other is the color swapping strat. The door strat is ultimately much safer, but generally speaking results in less DPS. Whereas the color swapping strat results in more DPS but is a lot riskier for the raid. And if you didn't already notice, yes, this is another cleave fight. I'd say I feel like a broken record, but we haven't even discussed an Uberak yet. Let's first discuss the color swapping strat, as it is a lot more mechanically intensive than the other one. You will want to save your rocket boots and sprint cooldowns for when any major mechanics happen. All of them are listed here. Regardless of what strategy you choose to use, you can guarantee that you don't die to any of these mechanics by using Cloak and Feint for the vortexes, and Cloak the single target abilities Touch of Light or Darkness respectively, which you can see here. So let's talk about how to plan properly so we can pump on this boss. I want to touch on the door strategy first because the opener is slightly delayed and we can end up blowing our trinket cooldowns before we even get a chance to cleave them. In this footage, it takes roughly 8 seconds for the bosses to get to the door, so make sure you set your trinkets on cooldown roughly 35 seconds before the boss is engaged to make sure that you have them up for when you can cleave both twins. You won't have to deal with this with the other strategy, but you can squeeze out a few extra seconds of uptime with the other strategy by swapping 30 to 31 seconds before combat. Now that your trinkets are set up, let's talk about the opener. I prefer to send a 5-point slice and dice, generating 4 to 5 combo points, then pulling my energy, then ripping Blade Flurry with my trinkets procced. Once you've used Blade Flurry, then you rip your Envenom, and then all you have to do from this point is spam Envenom. Mistakes I see a lot of rogues make during cleave fights is that they aren't envenoming half as much as they should be, because they've been taught clipping envenom is bad in single target spec. When using the cleave spec, you want to be using your finisher as much as humanly possible in that 20 seconds, which is why we start with a big slice and dice so as to ensure we don't have to refresh while Blade Flurry is active. The last thing I want to talk about is powering up. When you reach 100 stacks, you get one of these 2 damage buffs relating to whatever color you chose. If you use the door strat, you might not see this buff as you miss a lot of orbs from being tucked away in the doorway. I worked around this by sitting underneath the boss inside her hitbox so that I could get the buff with either strat. So your cooldowns for the beginning of the fight are set up. The only thing you need to pay attention to is your powering up buff and your Blade Flurry. In this clip I popped Blade Flurry right before I received the 100% damage buff, and if I had just waited a little bit longer I would have ended this fight with easily 20k DPS on the board. Oh, and make sure that you vanish when you get the damage buff. Obviously. Alright. And last but not least, we're finally at an Uberak. This fight has a lot going on for basically every role outside of DPS. So for you, this fight's going to be really, really, really easy. Let's get straight into the single target opener for this fight, then we will discuss the validity of the cleave spec and whether or not it's even worth using on an Uberak. Pay attention to when combat starts, because you'll see right here, you can squeeze an extra second or 2 out of your pre-pot. The single target CD phase is fairly simple on this boss. The fight lasts roughly anywhere from 4 minutes and 45 seconds to 5 minutes and 30 seconds based on how well you fine-tune healing received during phase 2. Meaning we will get 2 cooldown rotations during an Uberak. You will pop Cold Blood as fast as you can on this fight while fishing for a 5-point Envenom. If you are using an AP trinket still, make sure to use these in tandem with one another. When your trinkets come back off ICD, you will then vanish and keep pumping the boss until he submerges. Something you'll want to pay attention to as a rogue is tricksing your Affliction Warlock as the ads get pulled into position so that they die in a timely fashion before the next set spawns. The ads spawn every 45 seconds, giving you ample time to ensure your Warlock gets that bonus damage every single time they spawn.
Oh, I got it.
Okay, there's 2 left.
Both died.
Okay.
I got this one down right here.
You can double grip the one on the side.
Yeah, I'm waiting to help you kill it.
Maybe Bop
I got
Sushi?
20 seconds left.
Bob Sushi.
There isn't much to say about the intermission phase. Do whatever strat your guild is doing during the impales. Make sure to refresh Slice and Dice and Hunger for Blood on the Scarab Swarms, but don't pull aggro on them as they have a nasty stacking debuff that you don't want going into phase 2. A lot of guilds will require their players to use Frost Pots or Ice Deflector, or even potentially using Pendant of Thawing before the pull to mitigate each player's first tick of penetrating cold during phase 2. Feel free to use Pendant and Ice Deflector if it is at your disposal, but ignore using the Frost Pot as we will just cloak the debuff off so that we can still use our Haste Pot in phase 2. Make sure you are quick to cloaking off the debuff though, as it ticks for 6,000 damage every 3 seconds, and if your healers aren't quick on the trigger, you will die. After that, all your healers have to do is keep the raid alive, and all you have to do is pop Vanish and Cold Blood with your trinkets, as well as Haste Pot, and pump the boss until it dies. Congrats on your loot. But we're not actually done. There is also the BF mod spec to talk about. I don't think this spec is personally worth running, but I definitely think there will be guilds out there that struggle killing the ads or have a bad comp and they need the extra help with the AoE damage, and there might be a valid reason for you to need to run this spec. So we'll talk about it. The first set of ads spawn 10 seconds into the fight, which means we want to put our trinkets on cooldown 32 seconds before combat starts, meaning that we'll have our trinkets up 13 seconds into the fight. This will allow us to make it so that our Blade Flurry and our trinkets are procced at the exact same time, maximizing the amount of AoE damage that we're doing. You most certainly want to pair this with a Sapper or a Serenite Bomb. Everything that I said that applies for the single target spec also applies to the BF Mut spec outside of when you're popping your Vanish. You will obviously want to pair Blade Flurry with your Vanish, since the start of the fight is the only time we can guarantee both trinkets being up and overkill at the ready. You will Vanish after overkill fades from combat starting. Use the extra 20 seconds of overkill to pump into the ads with Blade Flurry active. I want to be clear about this though. What I am saying is that you will use the first 20 seconds of overkill from combat starting and then immediately Vanish while Blade Flurry is active. This will give you roughly 10 to 12 seconds of extra overkill time with your Blade Flurry and 10 to 8 seconds without it. If you use your Blade Flurry this way, you will see your Blade Flurry come back up during the intermission phase. You want to hold it until phase 2 starts because your Vanish and Cold Blood should be back up by then as well. You will then pop every cooldown that you have and pray your trinkets come off cooldown in time to Giga Pump the boss with Overkill, Cold Blood, Haste Pot, Blade Flurry, and trinkets active. You can also attempt to pre-plan your Hyperspeed Accelerator around this as well. All of that paired with a juicy heroism should net you some pretty big DPS. Well, that's it for my Assassination Rogue DPS guide for ToGC. I hope you guys liked the video. This is my first ever YouTube video, so I apologize if it's a little scuffed. I plan to release more content around Assassination Rogue after the next PTR, as well as going into ICC and who knows what else. You guys would be doing me a huge favor by liking, commenting, and subscribing if you like the content. If you didn't, feel free to harass me about it. I hope you guys have a great day, and I'll see you next time.